In this debate, we're not really debating whether the Gospels of the New Testament were reliable by ancient standards. We're not asking how they compare to ancient historians, how they stack up against Plutarch or against Livy or against other authors from the ancient world. We're debating, are the Gospels historically reliable? I'm taking that question to mean something pretty basic. Do the Gospels describe what actually happened in the past accurately? If you read a book today, if you read a biography, you read a history, suppose you read a study of Abraham Lincoln or Marco Polo or Julius Caesar, and you ask yourself, is it accurate? What you mean is, you're not asking, is it accurate in comparison, like is it about as badly accurate as some other book written at the same time? You're asking, is it accurate? Does it describe the things that this person said and did, or are there mistakes in it? You're asking, with respect to the Gospels, do they actually describe what Jesus said and did?
The first criterion is the author intended to write an accurate account. And here I contended that the Gospels were written so close to the events that large-scale conjecturing by their authors was not required. Moreover, the Gospel authors chose not to omit embarrassing details which suggest that they intended to write accurate accounts. Now, Bart responded that, well, we're really not talking about accuracy or reliability by ancient standards, we're talking by modern standards. Well, no, I'm talking about ancient standards, and here's why. Let's say 200 years from now, our standards for writing history change. As one of my students said today in a class, he said, what if, in the future, 200 years from now, we've got software, video that can assess what a person is their facial expressions and can tell what they're actually feeling and thinking at that time, stuff, of course, that we don't have today. Well, they might look and say, well, those people back in the early 21st century, they didn't write anything that was historically reliable. Well, of course, the standards 200 years from now may be different than they are right now. But we would expect them to extend some charity to us because we were operating by our present standards. Our objectives are a little bit different. And in the same way, I think the ancients would appreciate if we extended some charity to them as well. In fact, modern biography as we know it today is only about 200 years old.
It's true. These were people who were writing following ancient standards of historiography. They were following ancient standards. What else could they do? They were ancients. But most of us, when we want to know, are the Gospels reliable, we're not asking the question that academic pinheads like Mike and I are interested in. We academic pinheads are interested in things like, how does Luke stack up against Plutarch? How many of you have stayed up at night wondering how Plutarch stacks up against Luke? It's not something we worry about. If you want to know if the Gospels are reliable, look, you read the Bible, you want to know, did it happen this way? Did Jesus say this? Did he do this? Or not? For me, it's interesting. It's what I do for a living to figure out how close it is to Plutarch. But it's not really the question we're debating here. We want to know whether the Gospels record what Jesus said and did accurately. Suppose you find an ancient map, and you want to know, is this map accurate? Well, you wouldn't ask, did it follow ancient methods of following maps so that its mistakes can be explained? And so, by ancient standards, it's not bad. If you ask, is this map accurate? You're asking, if I want to go from point A to point B, will this map tell me how to do it or not? You want to know if it is accurate. Not whether the person was limited in his abilities to write a map, but whether it's accurate or not. We're asking, are the Gospels accurate or not?
Bart says, well, again, we're not looking by ancient standards, we're looking by modern standards. That's what we want to ask tonight. Well, I'm defining it by ancient standards, but I have contended that even by modern standards, we take these kinds of liberties. For example, Nabil's book, remember the kind of things that he said he did. That's the same kind of stuff that they did in antiquity. And Nabil was not unique in doing that. Lots of biographers and historians do it. Remember, I said 200 years from now, they're going to be doing things differently and make the way we do history now look poor. but we wouldn't want them to say, well, these guys were just bozos back then. They weren't reporting things that were reliable, and we should extend the same kind of charity to those in antiquity.
Let me point out some more evidence. Here's an interesting exercise for you to do sometime. There are 2 genealogies of Jesus in the New Testament. Genealogies that trace his bloodline. They're both interesting. One's in Matthew and one's in Luke. Matthew's is in chapter 1, Luke's is in chapter 3. They've got some major differences between them. Matthew's genealogy traces his line back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. Luke's genealogy traces him back to Adam. That's a genealogy. I've got an aunt who's a genealogist who traced my family line back to the Mayflower. The Mayflower, Adam and Eve, that's a genealogy. You get these 2 genealogies. Look at them yourself and ask, who is Joseph's father? Who's Joseph's grandfather? Who's his great-grandfather? Who's his great-great-grandfather? They are different genealogies, and they are both explicitly genealogies of Joseph. Now, it might seem a little bit weird that they're giving genealogies of Joseph in the first place, because Jesus is not related to Joseph.
He says, well, what about the genealogies in Matthew and Luke? Well, that these are conflicting. Well, number one, the authors are selective. Even some of the top evangelical Old Testament scholars out there will say that the genealogies are selective. They're only choosing certain generations that they want to put down. Moreover, Matthew is incorporating a rhetorical device called gematria, in which you assign numerical value to certain letters, like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, etc. And when you look at the word David, Dawid, it has the numerical value of 14. Well, what does Matthew do in his genealogy? Very, very clear. He divides it into 3 sets of 14. And even in the third set, he even cheats by reusing the 14th one in the second set, Jeconiah, just so he can get his 3 sets of 14. So it's really clear that what he's doing here is an artistic device of gematria. He's basically saying Jesus is the son of David. He's the son of David. He's the son of David. He's the Messiah. He's painting a literary portrait of Jesus. It doesn't mean the genealogy is just completely invented. It means that he is crafting it in such a way that would artistically illustrate the point that he's trying to make. And I have no problem with that.
We start with his birth. The birth of Jesus is narrated in 2 of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Nothing about his birth in the Gospel of Mark or in the Gospel of John. I'm going to focus first on the Gospel of Luke. Luke knows that Jesus was raised in the town of Nazareth, which is up in Galilee, the northern part of Israel, but he thinks that Jesus got born in Bethlehem, which of course is what most people think, because they've read the Gospel of Luke. Jesus gets born in Bethlehem. The question is, if his parents were from Nazareth, how did he get born in Bethlehem? Well, Luke tells us how. This is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 1. You can read this for yourself. In those days, the decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. Okay, well, nobody thinks that the entire world is being enrolled for a census. People off in China were not subservient to Caesar Augustus, so let's just say the Roman Empire. Everybody has to enroll for the census. What's that got to do with Jesus being born in Bethlehem? Well, his parents, Joseph and Mary, Joseph's not really his parent, but Joseph is from the lineage of King David, we're told. He's from the house and lineage of David. And David came from Bethlehem. And to register for the census, everybody has to go to their home of their ancestry. And since he's from David's family, David was from Bethlehem, he's got to go to Bethlehem. So they go to Bethlehem. And while they're there, Mary goes into labor and she gives birth in Bethlehem. We're told this happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. This is a hugely problematic passage, as Mike knows very well. What does it mean that Joseph went to the home of David? David was the king of Israel who lived 1,000 years before Joseph. Do you mean everybody in the Roman Empire is returning to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? Whoa, how's that supposed to work? Suppose that the Democrats win this next election and they impose more taxes on us, which is likely, and when they do that, we have to register for a tax by going to our ancestral home. You have to go to the ancestral home where your ancestor came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? And the entire country does this, and it's not mentioned in the newspapers. There is no reference to this census in any ancient source, period, apart from Luke and Christian authors who've read Luke. Why no reference to it, even though the reign of Caesar Augustus is well documented? Because it didn't happen. There was no census of the entire world where everybody had to register at their ancestral home. It didn't happen. Well, why does Luke say it happened? For a very simple reason. He knew that Jesus came from Nazareth, but he had to have him born in Bethlehem because that's where David was born. The Savior has to come. The Savior is the son of David, has to come from Bethlehem. The census didn't happen. Moreover, Luke says it happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Mike himself just told us, I'm not sure if you caught this part.
There are only a few historical items in the Gospels that are reasonably good candidates for being incorrect. For example, Luke's report of Augustus' census when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
Quirinius was the governor of Syria starting in the year 6 of the Common Era. King Herod died in the year 4 BCE. If Jesus was born under the reign of King Herod, he could not have been, the census could not have happened under Quirinius. There's a 10-year gap. Luke goes on to describe what happens after Jesus' birth. Mary goes into labor, she gives birth. We're told that Jesus was circumcised 8 days later, and then it came time for her purification, according to the law of Moses. This is a reference to a passage in Leviticus chapter 12. In Leviticus chapter 12, we're told that 32 days after a woman gives birth, she's supposed to perform a sacrifice for ritual purity. And so she performs the sacrifice, 2 turtle doves in the temple, and then we're told they went back to Nazareth. Okay, so they're just in town for a month. That's fine. But what do you do about what is said in the Gospel of Matthew about Jesus' birth? In Matthew, what happens is Jesus is born in Bethlehem. These wise men come to worship him. King Herod finds out that the king of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem, and he sends out the troops in order to kill the child. The troops kill every boy 2 years and under. Joseph learns in a dream that the slaughter is coming, and he's told to go to Egypt. He and Mary and Jesus go, they flee to Egypt. And they stay there until King Herod dies, and then they come back and relocate to Nazareth. If Matthew's right that they fled to Egypt, how can Luke be right that they went back to Nazareth a month later? The chronology doesn't work.
For example, the infancy narratives. He says that the sensitive is not mentioned anywhere else. Well, guess what? Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome, which is mentioned in the book of Acts, the only other place it's mentioned is in Suetonius's life of Claudius Caesar in chapter 26. If it had not been for 2 sentences in Suetonius, that would have been Luke would have been the only person mentioning it. And so just because it's singly attested doesn't mean that it didn't happen. In terms of Quirinius, yeah, I admit, this is problematic. It is one of those items in the Gospels that are potential errors. However, numerous alternatives to error have been proposed, and the matter is far from settled. Now, the Gospels were written within only 35 to 65 years of Jesus, and perhaps even earlier. When they were written, eyewitnesses of Jesus and those who had known them were still alive. So there was no need for the Gospel authors to employ the large scale of conjecturing present in Plutarch's biographies of much earlier times.
Mike contends that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony. I would like to know his evidence of it. They don't claim to be based on eyewitness testimonies. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, anyway, don't claim at all to be based on eyewitness testimonies. Jesus' native language is Aramaic. The disciples of Jesus were lower-class Aramaic day laborers who lived in a remote part of Galilee. They were not educated. At this time in ancient Palestine, the best study indicates that only 3% of the population could read and write. Catherine Hetzer, Jewish literacy in Roman Palestine. You can look it up and see the evidence. For all of this, you ought to look at the evidence, because it's the evidence that matters. Most people couldn't read and write. The disciples of Jesus couldn't read and write. They were Aramaic-speaking day laborers. They didn't have an education. They didn't write the Gospels. The Gospels don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are names given to the Gospels much later. The first time they're attested as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is at the end of the 2nd century, 100 years later. Here's something worth thinking about. The Gospels are written in highly literate Greek. They're written in highly literate Greek by educated Greek-speaking Christians living 40, 50, or 60 years later. They weren't eyewitnesses. Where does Mark claim to be based on Peter's testimony? He doesn't. Where does Matthew say that he's basing his Sermon on the Mount on an eyewitness? He doesn't. These are people who have heard stories about Jesus. They're living outside of Palestine. They don't speak Aramaic. They're Greek-speaking people living somewhere else. We don't even know where. Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, we don't know. How do they get their stories? Well, how does anybody get the stories in Ephesus about things that happened in Palestine? They've heard stories that have been circulating around the Roman world until they come to them. They're writing stories that they heard in Greek, not in Aramaic. 40, 50, 60 years later, of course there are differences in the Gospels. Think about who wrote these things.
Okay. All right, Bart, you said there in your second rebuttal that the disciples could not have been the Gospel authors because they weren't educated. The Gospels are written in Greek, but the disciples would have been spoken in Aramaic. So I think of Cicero, one of the most highly educated people in the late Roman Republic. And even though he's so educated, we've got lots of letters that he's written and essays that have survived, yet there's one occasion when he's writing to Tiro, his amanuensis, his secretary, his scribe, and he says, Antony was over for dinner and he asked me to read something, and I said, no, I can't because Tiro isn't here and he makes me sound so much better. And we know that Paul used scribes as well on several occasions. In fact, in Romans 16:22, it says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, send you my greetings. So we know that, since that's the crown jewel of Paul's letters, that these secretaries of Cicero and Paul probably did a whole lot more than just taking dictation. They did some major editing as well, and then Cicero and Paul would have signed off on it. So if that was good enough for people like Cicero and Paul, why is there such a problem thinking that the gospel authors were the same thing to some of the disciples? Why is it a problem that, let's say, John, if he's illiterate, that he just had an amanuensis, a scribe, write this stuff down and kind of do the editing? Or, if it wasn't John, number one of Jesus' disciples, the same kind of stuff with Matthew and this, and maybe Luke was someone who collected these testimonies, and if he didn't write it himself, then maybe he had a scribe or something, and same thing with Mark. I don't see what the problem is there.
Okay, yeah, happy to address that. About 5 years ago, I got really interested in the phenomenon of secretaries in the ancient world, and I looked up every reference that exists in Greek and Latin sources that I could find. There is no evidence of anyone at any time, to my knowledge, dictating an account in one language to be translated into another by a secretary. I don't know of a single instance. And the idea that secretaries are seriously rewriting what is dictated to them appears to be without foundation. As you know, Randy Richards wrote a book on secretaries, and he couldn't find any evidence of that.
Well, we couldn't find any evidence of what?
Of secretaries. There's only 2 examples in all of antiquity of a secretary who actually composed something for someone else.
Well, we're not saying they composed like the gospel for someone else. It's like they did it. I'm not saying a pseudonymity here. I'm talking about that someone like, well, I would think Romans probably happened that way with Paul.
Paul dictated Romans.
Dictated it, and that's all Tertius did.
Yes, that's what secretaries did. They wrote down dictation.
Oh, come on. Well, you got Cicero here that says, no, that's not the case, that he relied on Tiro to make his stuff better.
I give a detailed analysis of all of that.
I know you did. I read the stuff.
Counterforgery. So it didn't happen. So, but just take John, for example. So if somebody wants to say that, that John, the son of Zebedee, told somebody what happened and then somebody wrote it down. So once again, as with everything, I want to know what would make you think so. In other words, what about the Gospel of John makes somebody think that that's what happened? The Gospel of John, first of all, never mentions the name John.
True,
John
but none of Plutarch's lives mention the name Plutarch. None of Plato or Porphyry or Galen mentions his name.
Plutarch doesn't write a life of himself. The Gospel of John is about Jesus in relationship to his disciples. John is if John was a disciple for the Gospel of John, he'd be in the story, but his name never appears. So what does one make of that? I mean, in other words, I'm not concluding anything. I'm just saying that if John is such an important figure who wrote the Gospel of John, you'd have to say, well, he's so humble, he doesn't mention himself.
Do you believe that John was one of the disciples?
Yes.
Well, then how the name John doesn't appear in the Gospel of John? It's probably the beloved disciple.
Oh, well, as you know,
I happen to be with the minority of scholars that think John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John.
Yes, that is a minority. Yeah. John, the son of Zebedee, was a fisherman in rural Galilee.
Yeah.
He would not have had an education.
Well, no, I think he would have had an amanuensis, a scribe, and that wouldn't have been a problem at all.
Well, but I mean, how is somebody supposed to think you're just not making that up? I mean, what's
implausible about it?
What's implausible? Because we have no evidence of anybody in the ancient world dictating an account in one language to be translated into another.
Okay, so if you see me right now, and then tomorrow I come in, my hair's a whole lot shorter. You didn't see me get a haircut, but you can infer it. We've got stuff from the early church fathers, multiple accounts that talk about the authorship of these Gospels. And whether you like my evidence, at least I've got some evidence here that I'm presenting of who's.
Okay, give me some evidence from John itself that is composed by John the son of Zebedee.
I can't from John itself, but I do from the early church fathers who say it.
Okay, who's the first church father?
All right, wait a minute. You could say the same thing about Plutarch and say, give me some evidence that Plutarch wrote any of those biographies that's evident in the biographies.
Of course.
But nobody questions that Plutarch wrote them.
That's a question for every author from antiquity. Did this person write it or not?
But Plutarch doesn't claim to write them in any of the 50 surviving biographies, but nobody questions it. We still have good external evidence.
Classicists question every author from every book from antiquity. They question Plato, they question everybody all the way up. It's a question for every author.
But nobody seriously questions whether Plutarch wrote those 50 biographies.
Okay, so let me ask what the evidence is that John wrote it. Again, you say that there's no evidence from the gospel itself. You say, well, there's evidence from the church fathers. Okay, who's the first church father to say that John wrote it?
Well, that would probably be Irenaeus.
Okay, when was Irenaeus living?
Probably 170, 180.
Okay, it's usually dated to 185. When do you date the Gospel of John?
Probably 90 to 95.
Okay, so 90 years later, you have one person who says it was John.
Yeah. And that'd be the same as what, 1950?
Yeah, with having no record of it until now.
What do you mean, until then?
Well, there are other church fathers who know about the Gospel of John.
Sure.
They don't say anything about John writing it.
Well, that's an argument from silence.
I'm asking for what the evidence is.
Well, I gave you
I'm not using the evidence. I'm not saying the silence is evidence that he didn't write it. I'm asking you what the evidence is. And if your evidence is Irenaeus, we could have a long talk about Irenaeus. But
But at least I'm given evidence. It's not as
That's
though
not-
nobody knew who wrote it. And he's the latest one.
Okay.
Matthew and Mark have better attestation.
If we could.
I would say, though, there's clear evidence. You think John is the beloved disciple, right?
I do.
Okay. There is clear evidence that the beloved disciple did not write the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John indicates that the beloved disciple did not write the Gospel of John.
I know what you're going to quote, and I think he's speaking in the third person, which would have not been unusual for that day. Jesus speaks in the third person
In other words,
often.
the author does not claim to be the beloved disciple and claims he got his information from the beloved disciple.
I think he's speaking in third person.
He is speaking in the third person because he's talking about a third person.
Just like on the... What about his teachings? Now, unlike modern pastors who have to prepare a new sermon every week, Jesus was an itinerant preacher. And so he was traveling and speaking to new audiences all the time. So perhaps he had a dozen or so sermons, and he preached these same sermons over and 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 over. And then he told his disciples who had heard him preach this, he said, now I want you guys to go out and preach the same things. And I send you out by twos. They could go out, they could correct one another. And so they went out and they taught the same things they had heard countless times. They taught it over and 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 over. And then they returned, and Jesus debriefed them, and then he showed them how to adapt some of those teachings. Hey, when you're speaking to a Gentile audience, you can tweak this parable a little bit from what you do with the Jewish audience, and so forth. And so he illustrated this, and he showed them again the same teachings over and 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 over. And then, of course, he's crucified, rises from the dead, commissions his disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations. And now, for the next several decades, they preach the same things over and over. And you get the idea, right? Perhaps thousands of times. So Jesus' messages, his teachings, weren't something that he spoke of just once, and then his disciples had to recall decades later. And like any good teacher, Jesus taught in a way, he formulated these to make them memorable. So he taught in parables. He used rhetoric such as hyperbolic language to shock his listeners. Unless you hate all your family members, you can't be my disciple. If your right eye makes you sin, rip it out and throw it from you. We don't forget these things. Parable of the prodigal son, who forgets that, right? So the essence of Jesus' deeds and teachings could quite easily have been recalled accurately even decades later.
The words of Jesus. Do we know what Jesus actually said? The most famous part of Jesus' teaching is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. It is 3 chapters of Jesus talking. 3 chapters. Matthew's gospel was probably written in the 80s of the Common Era. That is, it sounds like that's the dating that Mike is going with when he said the Gospels were written between 40 and 65 years later. So probably 50, 55 years later is when Matthew's written. Matthew's writing a sermon that Jesus gave on this mount. He's writing this account 50 years after the sermon was given. How well can you remember Barack Obama's last State of the Union address from 2 years ago? Could you write it down 2 years ago? What if you waited 50 years? Could you write word for word what Barack Obama said in his speech? You were probably paying attention. I was paying attention, and I don't even know what he was talking about. The Gospel of John has a speech of Jesus that begins in chapter 13. He's giving it to his disciples, his last evening with them. Chapter 13, the speech goes into chapter 14, all of 14, goes through into all of chapter 15, and then all of chapter 16. And in chapter 17, he leaps into a prayer that goes all of chapter 17. It's 5 chapters, written 65 years later. What is the likelihood that we know what Jesus said on this occasion? Now, Mike has just told us that the way the gospel writers knew what was said is because Jesus said these things over and over and over and over. I'm not going to say how many overs that is because I don't have enough time, but that over and over again. You will notice that he never pointed out whether that is ever said in the New Testament. Where in the New Testament does it ever say that Jesus gave the same sermon over and over and over and over and over and over again? It doesn't say anywhere. Where does he give the same speech over and over again in the New Testament? He never gives the same speech more than once in the New Testament. So why does Mike think that he did? Because Mike thinks he did. That's just like, well, that makes sense. So that must have been how it happened. But what's the evidence? Historians prefer evidence, and I don't know of any. There's certainly no evidence that he gave the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over and over again. It's given as a one-time speech. And he certainly didn't give his farewell discourse to his disciples over and over again. It was the last thing he said to them the night he was arrested and then sent to jail.
The fourth criterion is that the authors and their sources were capable of reporting accurate history. And here I contended that the miraculous nature of Jesus' deeds and both the repetition and rhetoric of his teachings made it quite easy to recall them accurately decades later. Now, Bart did respond here. He brought up the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' speech, high priestly prayer and speech in the Gospel of John. And he said, well, think about Barack Obama's presidential address. Do you remember that? Well, no. I only heard it once, and it was years ago. But again, that's different than Jesus' disciples who would have heard Jesus teach the same things over and over and over, and then they taught it over and over and over, and then Jesus went, and you know how it all goes. Well, Bart says, where does it say that Jesus said this over and over and over? Well, I agree, the Gospels don't say that, but I do think it's a fair inference. That would be the standard practice back then of what a teacher did with his disciples. Moreover, how often do the disciples or the Gospels mention Jesus eating? I think we can assume that he ate a whole lot more frequently than the Gospels mention. So the standard practice would have been for him to teach these same things over and over rather than come up with a new sermon for every village, town, and city. And I think because that would have been the standard practice, the burden of proof rests on Bart if he wants to argue otherwise. Now, in terms of the Sermon on the Mount, there's no question this is not a transcript of Jesus' teachings of what he said on that particular occasion. I don't know of any New Testament scholars, even evangelical New Testament scholars, who would say that Matthew is a transcript of everything Jesus said on that occasion. But they would agree, I think, to the last one of them, that what Matthew has done is he has taken a core of some teachings that Jesus gave on that occasion, probably some of what we see in the Gospel of Luke, and then he has called a bunch of teachings that Jesus made over his ministry, and he's artistically combined them together in the Sermon on the Mount that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. The same thing would happen with the Gospel of John, that a lot of Jesus' teachings would have been put in that, and that wouldn't have been necessarily everything that he would have said on that occasion. This would have been standard practice for writing ancient biography and history because they didn't have camcorders, they didn't have audio recorders. Shorthand was in its infancy stages of development. This is the kind of way that history was reported. It is not to say that Matthew and John were inventing these teachings of Jesus. By no means. These would have been things that Jesus would have taught, but not necessarily all of them on that particular occasion. The fifth criterion is we can verify numerous items reported. Many items in the Gospels reflect existing knowledge pertaining to the historical setting in which the Gospels are situated. Richard Bauckham has shown that when ancient documents and inscriptions are considered, the names mentioned in the Gospels and the book of Acts are not only common names of Palestinian Jews of that period and not those of Jews elsewhere, they also appear with roughly the same frequency in the Gospels and the book of Acts that we find in extra-biblical sources. At the very minimum, this suggests all of the Gospel authors, or the sources from which they drew, were acquainted with Palestine around the time of Jesus. We also know that places mentioned in the Gospels actually existed. For example, Capernaum, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Bethsaida, Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. We know that several of the people mentioned in the Gospels actually existed during the period in which they're situated. Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, Quirinius, the Herods, Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas, Jesus, John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus.
Mike had one very interesting point that I wanted to talk about for a second, because it was the first time that he actually got to evidence from the Gospels in his point 5. I don't know if you're all taking notes. It doesn't look like you are, but his point 5 was that you can verify names in the Gospels and places in the Gospels. The Gospels mention places that actually exist. Therefore, they're reliable. They name people. They give names like the name James and the name John. And, these are names that like occur at the time, so they're accurate. And, I just don't see how that makes the Gospels accurate. So I teach in Chapel Hill. Suppose in 2,000 years, there's a story floating around that on February 21st in 2018, Professor Ehrman was going from his office in Carolina Hall to his classroom in Murphy Hall, where he was teaching a class on the historical Jesus. And before he got to that building, it was blown up by a bomb placed by some student who didn't want to take his midterm, or something like that. All right, so in 2,000 years, an archaeologist comes around and he digs up. There is a place like Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, it's a place. And they find the records, and there is a Professor Ehrman who was teaching there. It's accurate. And he was in Carolina Hall. That's where he taught. They find the records that, yes, he taught a class in Murphy Hall that day. That story is historically accurate because the names and the places fit. No, it's not accurate. There was no bomb that went off this morning to blow up the building because of a disgruntled student. The story isn't accurate. And so what good does it do to tell you that, yes, there really was a place named Nazareth? There really was a place named Bethlehem. Yes, Joseph is a common name. Mary is a common name. Well, that's nice, but it doesn't tell you if the stories are accurate. To know if the stories are accurate, you have to look at them. You have to engage in a study of them to see whether they're accurate. If you have two stories that tell the same story and they're at odds with each other, they both obviously can't be right.
Okay, number 5, we can verify numerous elements reported by the ancient author, and I mentioned how many items in the Gospel, such as names, places, people, and many of Jesus' teachings and deeds can be verified. He says, well, this doesn't mean it's accurate overall. Well, I agree with that. But remember, I said the names, places, Jesus' deeds, and his teachings. You put all that together. Look, we just don't have anachronisms. It's not like they're talking about Mary and Joseph and Thomas and Fred. All right, these are all names that would have been common to Jews in that region, in that period. You go outside of Palestine, you got different Jewish names. So it shows that these authors were familiar with Palestine around the time of Jesus, and that points to reliability. It's not something that you would just look at in and of itself and say, that means it's reliable, but it sure points in that direction. It favors reliability.
Here's the big deal. It is really, if you just look at the Gospels carefully, if you just read them carefully, by reading the story in one Gospel with the story of another Gospel and comparing them, you can see that there are these differences. They can't all be accurate, especially in those small things. But what about the big things? Here's a big thing. In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes claims for himself as a divine being. Jesus goes around in Galilee and in Jerusalem claiming to be divine. He claims that he is equal with God. I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. I am is the name that God gave himself when talking to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. Jesus says before Abraham, Abraham lived 1,800 years earlier. And Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. The Jewish opponents know exactly what he's saying. They pick up stones to stone him to death. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Whoa. That's in the Gospel of John. Jesus repeatedly makes divine claims for himself. And here's a striking factoid. He never does so in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. How can that be? As Mike pointed out, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are based on earlier sources. We know some of these sources. Mark, Q, M, L. In none of these sources does Jesus make these claims for himself. Only in the last gospel, written 65 years after Jesus' death, does anybody have Jesus declare himself as God. How could Jesus himself have actually called himself God, gone around in his ministry calling himself God in Galilee and in Jerusalem, spent his ministry talking about himself as a divine being? How could that have happened? And our earliest sources don't talk about it. This wasn't important enough even to mention? It would be the most important thing you could possibly say about Jesus. He called himself God. But he does it only in our last gospel. You see why it's important whether these gospels are accurate. Did Jesus call himself God or not? Thank you very much. Or take another thing, at the end of Jesus' life, Peter's denials of Jesus. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Does he deny him 3 times before the cock crows at all, or before the cock crows twice? And if you look at the denials, he denies him to different people in different gospels. The way some fundamentalists reconcile this is by saying that Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed, and 3 times before it crowed twice, so that Peter denied Jesus 6 times. Well, that's clever, and it's precisely what none of the Gospels say. Now, Mike doesn't do that. I mean, he agrees. This is a contradiction. But here we go, another contradiction.
He said, well, Peter denies Jesus. Did the cock crow once or twice? And who questioned him? Hey, these are discrepancies in the Gospels, no question about it. Plausible alternatives or solutions have been looked at this. I think the toughest one was the second person who was interviewing Peter there and saying, hey, you are one of him. And Peter denies it. Well, in Mark, it's the same servant girl. In Matthew, it's a different one. In Luke, it's a male servant. So what's going on here? I don't know. I mean, I could present a couple of different things. Worst case scenario, there's a tradition that people know, because there was eyewitnesses, that Peter was questioned 3 times in the courtyard of the high priest. He denied it 3 times, and they're trying to fill in the blanks, as any good narrative biographer or historian would do. It doesn't mean that the account itself is unreliable.
A difference again in the death of Jesus. The gospel writers want to emphasize different things. And the problem with thinking that they're all accurate is that it means that you read one of the Gospels as if it's saying the same thing as another one of the Gospels, when in fact they might be emphasizing different things based on the different stories that they've heard. Here's the example. It has to do with Jesus' demeanor going to his death. What was Jesus' demeanor going to his death? How was he approaching his own death? In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, and he's silent. Pilate can't understand why he's silent. Pilate asks him, are they king of the Jews? And Jesus says only 2 words, su leges. You say so. That's all he says. He's taken off to be crucified and doesn't say anything on the road to crucifixion. He's silent the entire way. He's nailed to the cross, and he's silent the entire time. Both of the people being crucified with him, both of the robbers being crucified with him, both of them mock him in Mark's Gospel. And Jesus is silent, doesn't say anything. You wonder what is going on here. Why is Jesus so silent? It's as if he's in shock. And at the end, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus says the only time in the entire proceeding, at the end, he finally cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And he dies. That's it. It is the most amazing account, gripping in its pathos, of a man who at the end feels forsaken by God himself and dies on the cross. As Mike has pointed out, Mark was one of the sources for Luke. Luke also tells an account of Jesus going to his death, basing his account on Mark, but changing it in places. And the changes he makes are significant. In Luke's account, while Jesus is going to be crucified on the road, he's not silent. He sees these women by the side of the road weeping. And he turns to them and he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you." He's more concerned about these women than he is about himself. When he arrives and they nail him to the cross, he's not silent. He prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." While he's hanging on the cross, Jesus is not silent. He actually has an intelligent conversation with one of these robbers. One of the robbers mocks Jesus in Luke. The other one tells him to be quiet because Jesus hasn't done anything to deserve this. And he turns his head to Jesus and he says, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus is not in shock in Luke's gospel. He's not wondering why this is happening to him. He's not wondering why God has forsaken him. Jesus knows exactly what's happening to him. He knows why it's happening to him, and he knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise with this man next to him. Most telling of all, at the end of Luke's account, instead of crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He doesn't say that in Luke because he doesn't feel forsaken in Luke. Instead, in Luke, he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he dies. This is a Jesus who is calm and in control of his situation. It's a very different Jesus from the one portrayed in Mark. What people do, though, is they take Mark's account and they take Luke's account and they lump them together into one account so that Jesus says and does everything in both accounts, thereby eliminating the emphasis of each one. And then they throw in Matthew and John for good measure, and you end up with the 7 last words of the dying Jesus. You can do that if you want with the Gospels. But if you combine them all together, ignoring the emphasis of each, you have written your own gospel. You're free to do that, but it's not one of the Gospels of the New Testament. Each gospel is different. And it's not just the fact they have contradictions or errors. It's that each one is trying to emphasize something distinct. And if you don't let them each emphasize what they emphasize, you're robbing the authors of their own emphasis and their own integrity as authors who are trying to communicate a story about Jesus. Let me move to the end of Jesus' life, his death and resurrection. It is interesting that both the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John tell you exactly the day on which Jesus died. It was sometime around the Passover feast when Jews would celebrate the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, by having a lamb slaughtered in the temple on the day of preparation for the Passover. You prepare the Passover meal, which involves eating lamb that night. The lambs get slaughtered on the day of preparation, and that night is when the next day begins in Jewish reckoning. The night's the next day. When it gets dark, that's when the day begins in Jewish reckoning. So in all the Gospels, Jesus dies sometime around there somewhere. In John's Gospel, John is clear. Jesus dies on the day that they are preparing to eat the Passover, the day before the Passover meal is eaten. Mark's Gospel is also explicit. Jesus dies the day after the Passover meal is eaten. You don't need to take my word for it. Look it up. Mark chapter 14, verse 12, and then Mark chapter 15, verse 25. It's the day after the meal was eaten. John chapter 19, verse 14. It was the day before the meal was eaten. They're explicit, both of them. But how can it be both? Now you might say, look, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean, he died sometime around there, fine. Okay, but it actually matters to John and it matters to Mark. It matters to John because John is our only gospel that says that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John is the only gospel that says that, and he has Jesus killed exactly when the lambs are being killed to show that he's the Lamb of God. It matters to him when Jesus died. And it matters for Mark that Jesus died the next day. Because for Mark, when Jesus gives his Last Supper, it's a Passover meal. So that the Christian, the Lord's Supper, is a replacement of the Passover meal. It's important to both of them when Jesus died, but he dies on different days. They can't both be right. If you're asking, are the Gospels accurate? Well, one or both of them had to get it wrong because Jesus didn't get crucified 2 different times. He got crucified once.
Bart mentioned the death of Jesus, that John changes the day. I agree with him on this. I think John does change the day and the time of Jesus' crucifixion. He places it the day of the Passover meal, whereas the synoptics have it the day after the Passover meal. And John does this for theological reasons to highlight that Jesus is the Lamb of God, something which Paul had already mentioned in his letters decades earlier. So it's not like he's inventing the theology. Nobody, not even Bart, is going to dispute that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate and died as a result. It's just a matter of how John has done these things. And guess what? It's no different than what other of the most well-respected Roman historians did. For example, Tacitus moves the suicide of Piso months back in order to add to the drama of it. And Tacitus is considered to be the most accurate and greatest of the Roman historians. Sallust, another one of the most respected historians, talks about he takes the speech of Catiline and moves it back months in one case and moves it forward in another, a different one forward in another case in order to highlight the intensity and the nature of what was going on. But the speech actually happened. He just puts it at a different time. This is something, again, that would have been allowable in ancient history and biography.
There are a number of implausible things that you find in the gospel accounts of Jesus' death. The most famous one is in the Gospel of Matthew. It's when Jesus is being crucified. We're told in Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 and following, that when Jesus was crucified, the curtain in the temple was torn in two, the earth shook, so there's this earthquake, the rocks were split. I've never known what that means, but the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. These are the zombies of Matthew, the walking dead. Really? I think Mike's going to agree with me on this one. This did not happen. Are the Gospels accurate? Matthew says it happened. I don't think it happened.
Bart mentions the saints raised at Jesus' death. I agree with him here. I think if we had a video camera and we're back there, I don't think we would have witnessed it. But as I've written and have in print elsewhere, I think that based on the Jewish literature and the Greco-Roman literature in the period, that Matthew is doing no differently than the Jewish and Greco-Roman authors here, and he's just basically using special effects, a literary device to highlight the importance of the death that had taken place. Jesus, the Son of God, had died. Now, to say that Matthew is this is a false story in there, I think is a miscategorization. It'd be like 200 years from now if a historian says, hey, I read that about 9/11 and some of the eyewitness said 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. Well, I looked through all the seismographs and I didn't notice any kind of earthquakes happening that day, so it must be historically unreliable. We'd say, no, you're missing the whole point. It's a linguistic idiom that was part of that culture. I think that's exactly what Matthew is doing here.
You do agree that there are things in the Gospels that are not accurate as related. You don't think the zombies thing happened.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to say that every single word happened precisely
no, I'm not asking
in
that.
a legal transcript,
I'm not asking
it
that.
didn't.
I'm just asking, do you think there are things in the Gospels that are not accurate?
I don't know. I gave you some candidates that I think they may
Okay.
be incorrect, but I would say the same of Plutarch.
Do you think, yes, do you think that the zombies happened?
I don't think if we had been there, we would have seen the zombies.
Okay.
I think that is a rhetorical literary device going on.
Do you think there are other things we wouldn't have seen?
So give me an example.
I'm asking you for examples. Is that the only thing in the Gospels that you think is not accurate?
Well, I didn't say it's not accurate. You're putting words in my mouth.
Wait.
If I said 9/11 was an earth-shaking event, you could say, well, that's not accurate, Mike. And I'm saying you're missing the whole point.
Right. So I'm trying to get my mind around this. So when Matthew says that the dead came out of the tomb and walked around, you're saying, no, that didn't really happen, but you're saying it's not inaccurate.
I'm saying it's the same kind of genre there as Peter and Pentecost when he's referring to Joel chapter 2 with young men having visions, old men having dreams, and Joel chapter 2 talks about the sun going dark and the moon turning into blood. No, I don't think that they thought the sun went dark, the moon turned into blood that day. I think they're using this as poetic, apocalyptic kind of imagery.
I'm just getting a little frustrated because I'm not getting a direct answer.
Well, I'm trying to give you, I think you're mixing genres here, and it's not fair.
What's the genre of the zombies?
I think that this is apocalyptic kind of symbolism that's put in there. Just like when they talk about eclipses of the sun and comets in the sky on many of these occasions, that we can show that these eclipses of the sun didn't happen, but the comet was actually there. They would mix these portents in order to highlight the intensity and the meaning behind the event.
Okay, I don't know what you're talking about. So, right.
Well, keep reading my book.
No, okay. I'm just sorry, Mike, because you don't think that the zombies came out of the tomb, but you want to say it's still accurate. Okay. There are other problems with the Passion narratives. Let me just give you one more in my conclusion, having to do with the resurrection narratives. Here's an exercise for you. You don't need to trust Mike when he says, that you can trust the Gospels. You can just read them yourself. And I'll tell you how to read them to see if they're accurate. Read one account of the resurrection, read Matthew's account, then list everything that happens. Read Mark and list everything, then Luke, list everything, John, list everything that happens, and compare your lists. Do it yourself. Think for yourself and figure it out. Are they accurate or not? Not if they contradict each other. In Matthew's account, when Jesus is raised from the dead, the women go to the tomb and they're told to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. They are to tell the disciples to go to Galilee and meet Jesus there. The women go tell the disciples, and the disciples go to Galilee and they meet Jesus there. And that's where Jesus gives his final instructions, and the gospel ends. In the Gospel of Luke, the women are not told to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. They're told to tell the disciples what Jesus told them when he was in Galilee, that he'd be raised. And Jesus then appears to the disciples and he tells them, do not leave the city Jerusalem. And they don't leave the city of Jerusalem. They see Jesus in Jerusalem, and he says, stay there until the power comes upon you from on high. In other words, when the Holy Spirit comes upon them. That's what's going to happen on the day of Pentecost 50 days later. And they don't leave the city. They're still in Jerusalem in Judea until the day of Pentecost 50 days later, after Jesus has ascended to heaven. Well, if Luke is right that they stayed in Jerusalem, how can Matthew be right that they went to Galilee? They can't both be right.
The one that you cited, like, did Jesus first appear to them in Galilee or Jerusalem? I think that has a reasonable explanation for it, and some of these things have really good explanations.
Let me just review. In Luke, he says, don't leave Jerusalem.
Right.
And they don't.
Yep.
In Matthew, they're told to go to Galilee, and they do.
Yes.
Okay, so what's the reasonable explanation for that?
I would think that Luke is certainly compressing the account and setting everything in Jerusalem. It doesn't mean they didn't go to Galilee. Luke definitely knows that, as you said in your opening statement, you've got Luke having the resurrection, all of the appearances, and the ascension happening on Easter. But Luke obviously knows it happened over a longer period of time because in his sequel, the book of Acts chapter 1, he says that he appeared to them over a period of 40 days.
Wait, Mike, I'm just confused here. Luke says, don't leave Jerusalem. They don't leave Jerusalem. They're there until the day of Pentecost. But you're saying that he thinks they did go to Galilee?
Yeah, why couldn't it be that he is compressing the account? Like, for example, I think that first appearance probably happened in Galilee, but Luke situates it in Jerusalem there when you compare the two accounts. He's talking about the same one, and he's putting everything.
You can just stop right there. So the appearance was in Galilee, but Luke says it was in Jerusalem. And you think that that's accurate?
Yeah, he's compressing the account. I see what he's doing. There's no problem there. He's compressing the account for economy of time or space, and then he's wanting to emphasize Jerusalem as probably the headquarters of the church.
What would make it inaccurate?
He appeared to them in Africa.
Well, why couldn't you say he appeared to them in Africa?
Well, if he did, that'd be fine. But if he's doing a compression here, time compression.
He's not compressing time, he's compressing places.
Yeah,
one says he did not appear to them in Galilee, and the other says that one says that he did not appear in Galilee, the other says he did appear in Galilee.
No, one says he appeared in Galilee, one says he appeared in Jerusalem.
They don't leave Jerusalem. So how could they see him in Galilee?
Because Luke is compressing the account and he situates everything in Jerusalem.
Yes, he does.
He obviously knows that, but he has it all on Easter, whereas, again, Acts chapter 1, he's obviously knows that he was there for a longer period of time.
Yeah, in Acts 1, he's there for 40 days with them, and where is he?
He's in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Well, no, it doesn't say.
Yes,
it does. It doesn't say that he was in Jerusalem the whole time. He ascended from the Jerusalem area on the Mount of Olives, but it doesn't say he was there the whole time.
Okay.
I see no reason why he couldn't have gone to Galilee in the meantime.
Except he says stay in Jerusalem.
Yep, and he could have said that after they returned from Galilee.
All right.